Wakey, wakey. Let's kick this afternoon session off. So we're doing building on-premise app, management service app today. Obviously, all this week, you're going to hear lots about apps, whether it's from a development perspective or user perspective. Of course, none of this works if we don't actually set it up properly in the first place. So that's why we're all here, is to learn how to set up your app management service internally and support it to your users in your on-prem network. My name's Steve Smith, and I've been training this for a very, very long time. Also the co-founder of the user group in the UK with Nick Swan for the SharePoint one. I think one of the biggest in the world and most active, I think, now. And I know a lot of you guys are from all over the world, and I would strongly encourage anybody that can to join their local user group and be part of it, because it's a wonderful community that we've got and we've built. You can find me through my email address, and my Twitter's on there. So for all you Twitterers out there, feel free to ping me on that. So the agenda, I'm a bit tight on time today, so I'm going to not dwell too much on the blurb. So we're going to do a quick overview of the application management service, a quick look at the architecture, and then I'm going to take you through a full setup and configuration of it, start to finish, and deploy an app on it, just so you see the whole 9 yards of what's involved. And there is quite a bit from an IT pro's perspective that you're going to have to think about, that you're going to have to involve potentially your other infrastructure guys to set this up correctly. Of course, the term correctly is the word we're looking for here, right? So first and foremost, we're going to go through an overview of what is an app and the difference between online and on-premise. So when you have these discussions with your developers, etc., you're all singing from the same song sheet. So the bottom line is an app is just an extended functionality of SharePoint. It's the ability for us to develop custom code, deploy it within a user environment. This is no different than us deploying a document library that's been custom built, or a custom list, or a Nintex workflow model, or a custom workflow model, or anything we choose that's not out the box that we want to customize. How do we deploy it to our user base? Of course, the problem is Microsoft, with their hosting the cloud scenario, said, well, sandbox solutions weren't really the answer we're looking for in terms of extended functionality. So how are we going to create a mechanism that allows users to deploy that functionality easily, simply, in a site collection and a site model? How many people actually have been playing around with 2013 so far? How many people in the audience so far have had a look at it? Right, so probably just over half of you. So those of you that have been doing that, you'll notice that when you've been tinkering around in the site model, how so much more has been dropped down into the site management layer, hasn't it? There's so much more we can do as a site owner than we've ever been able to do before. You know, deploying apps is no different. Of course, we can decide through permissions who can actually deploy the apps. And I'll show you in a little bit where, as IT pros, we can actually structure the permissions tree for who can even see the apps in the first place. But there are, as usual, a few little trade-offs that we have to look at. The other thing about an app as well is that it's stored either online in the SharePoint Microsoft Marketplace, or it's stored in-house, on-premise, in our own SharePoint deployment. That's what we're going through today. If we wanted to deploy it in the cloud so that our users could download it to their mobile phones, or we could just go into a site, browse the marketplace, and install it either on-prem or, you know, as a cloud site. For that, you're going to have to deploy an app, create it, develop it, put it into the Microsoft approval process, get it approved, and then it goes into the online marketplace that can be used for purchase through a subscription process, for example, or free, either way. We're currently actually going through this process ourselves. We've just become a seller ID within the marketplace because we're actually developing our help desk product that will go into an Office 365 app model for the app users in that environment. Not for on-prem, but primarily for the Office 365 world. So it's interesting how apps are making companies, even like ours, think about the things that we develop as a product and then decide, is this a product that could be both on-prem or cloud-based, or is this a 365-based app, and we do an on-prem differently because we get more control or more flexibility on-premise. So these are some of the things that we had to think about as well. From a marketing perspective, the other thing to think about is that Microsoft have now entailed everything into the app model. So list and libraries are defined as apps, even though they're list and libraries. But from a browser usability perspective, if a user goes to add an app, a document library and a list is in that space of adding an app, which could cause some confusion going down the road of adoption from when you've been teaching them something else, that you've now got to make them think slightly different about the word app. Of course, we do forget, of course, at the end of the world, that the big point of apps is that people are actually used to them, aren't they? If they've got an iPad or they've just been at home browsing, they're actually used to the term app. So hopefully we can sort of twist it to our advantage. Now, the marketplace is obviously what has been published and is available from Microsoft's online store, whether it's through a mobile phone, through a SharePoint team site. If we go browse, add an app, go to the online SharePoint store, this is what we get to see. Little categorizations on the left and a choice of the apps to install on the right. Some are free, some are pay for, you have to give credit card details, whatever. Depends what the tool is. But they're all out there right now. So if you want to test this stuff, down the road, once you've set all this up, not just on-prem, but also just testing apps, you can just go online and start messing around with them right now. However, when we deploy them on-premise, what we're trying to do is not just control permissions to the users, we're also trying to control what apps we actually give the users. Unfortunately, and you're going to see this when I build it, an app store, or an app catalog as we call it, is aligned to a web application, not a site collection. So unfortunately, if you want to actually say, oh, I only want my users to see these apps, and that's it, and you've only got one web application, then you're going to have to put all of that security into the app itself, because the catalog's going to show every user every app that you've deployed. So if you've only got one web app, multiple site collections, you are still consuming from one catalog on-prem. So when our user goes to add an app, they add the app, it says, do you want to trust this app? Or depending on what the type of app is, they'll get either a prompt or not, and then it will be deployed into their site contents page. And at that point, depending on what the app does, it's either ready to use, or it adds a list or a library to their quick launch bar, or whatever it is that the app's doing. I've got a couple of apps that I'm going to put on. So the architecture this is the basic architecture that's happening. Now I'm going to also take you through the process of setting it up. But just as a quick kind of brief as what's going on here. So on the downside, on the left, we've got the internal user. So an internal user goes into SharePoint. Yep. So they're sitting here in their environment, and they're sitting on a home page, and this is where they are, right? So they're sitting there, and they go, I want to add apps and lists and libraries. And this is the page that goes into that, oh, okay, what sort of things are we adding? But we'll notice that there's no option to add anything from internal apps because I haven't actually published any. But it does say, oh, let's go to the SharePoint store. So we can quite happily see that there is that SharePoint store on the left-hand side that gives the users the ability to go and purchase. Now, we can restrict that says, actually, I don't want the user to purchase it. I want the users to request an app, and then we choose as a company whether we purchase it or not. And that's something that we can control in central administration. So when we were talking about this user on the left, that's the user there. So they've gone into their team site and they've got that storefront page presented to them. Now, depending on what they choose to go for, if they try to go to the internet, it's going to come straight down from the online marketplace. There's no need for them to go through through the app management service once they've got the rights to see it. But if the user's looking for apps that are internal, ones that we've developed and deployed and made available, then the process for that is subtly different, because first and foremost, they want to be able to browse the apps that we've published to them. That is using this App Catalogue, and you'll notice that there's this internal App Catalogue site collection that we've got at the top there. That is what's displaying our apps to the user. But on top of that, we've got the application management service, and that's responsible for basically showing, presenting the user in effect with what are the apps that we've got in terms of the database that's housing them, and what are the permission models for those apps. So within the database is the permissions model and obviously the content databases for their site collections where the apps are going to be added. And so the app management service is more of a redirect to redirect it to the app management database, and that's where all the key licensing information is stored. Now, of course, if we're going to develop in-house, the developer in the top right-hand corner, these are the guys that are making those custom apps, and they're the ones that are going to either upload them or give them to us, or a app management power user, to add them to the App Catalogue site collection. And it is just a normal site collection with a couple of extra lists in it. And I'll show you that in a minute. So there's not really too much in terms of complexity around it, in terms of the architecture. The complexity comes around what we need to do internally to get it working. So this is the architecture that we as IT pros need to follow to get this thing working properly. Number one, we need to actually have an application management service application. That's something that we can create either in PowerShell or in the UI. We also need to have a subscriptions service application. Historically, in SharePoint 2010, you would have built one of these if you were doing a multi-tenancy model. In an on-premise application management service model, it plays a very important role in defining and managing the unique identities of the apps that we deploy. Because at the end of the day, we could have thousands of apps potentially. Who's managing those apps? Who's making sure we don't have two that overlap with each other and have, you know, the same unique variable names? The subscription service is responsible for that. We have to start the server services, as we always do with any service application in SharePoint. And then we also have to create an isolated DNS domain name. Now, I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail in a second. In fact, I'm going to probably go down there now. Actually, I'll go on in a second. We need to have an isolated DNS domain. So this is the DNS domain name that we're going to use for our apps. So in other words, we could have something like mycompanyapps.com. So this enables us to create part of the unique naming convention structure of apps. So the subscription service, alongside the unique naming conventions, are going to allow us to give those generic names something more unique within the business model. We've also got an app prefix. So not only have we got a DNS name at one end, we've also got an app prefix at the start of it. And this is going to be prefixed to every single app that you deploy into your SharePoint farm. It is one per farm. So, I don't know, I've never got anywhere past apps for the name of mine, because I've never thought of anything more useful for it. We'll configure those in central administration. The other thing you're going to notice is a web application is needed that is, in essence, a bucket web app, as we'll call it. A bit like your default website. It starts on port 80, no host header, it's just there as a catch-all website, right? You always know when you go there, don't you, when you've put the wrong URL in or there's no host header, because when you go there, you get the default IIS welcome page. And that's the site that's on that root default website. So we're actually going to replace that. We're going to replace that with a catch-all bucket web. We're not using it in this instance for host name site collections, but we could. We're using it purely as the catch-all for when our apps are being deployed to then go to the relevant web applications that are hosting them. And you'll notice that I mentioned also 80 or 443 as your port numbers, because one of the other things about apps from a security model perspective, if we're really starting to get into the nuts and bolts of security, is that when users are going to apps by default, they are not secure. It's open authentication. So if we wanted to secure those apps and connectivity to those apps from a user across the network or outside extranets, we'd want to be doing it on 443. In fact, one of the stories you're going to hear a lot of this week is people talking about using 443 by default on SharePoint in 2013. And there is a big shift in the way we are looking at our architecture modeling for SharePoint 2013, where we are almost now at the point with just recommending across the board that you just go SSL from day one for all your web apps, because it just makes life a lot easier as we go, because things like this and host name site collections just makes more sense from a long-term architecture model. A site collection for hosting the App Catalogue, and finally the App Catalogue itself to host the apps. So that's the core architecture. So the process this is my way that I've set it up. This is my steps, the 10 steps that I do. And it seems to work pretty well so far. So the first thing is create a web app on port 80. So what do we mean by that? We create a web application in SharePoint, either through PowerShell or the UI. It's going to create a site in IIS that's going to have no IP address by default, right? It's going to be no IP address, but it will be on port 80 or 443, depending on what we want to do. So before I expand on that, let me actually run that. So just to show you that there is no smoke and mirrors going on here, here's my web apps in my current farm. So I've got a My Sites, I've got a portal that's just hosting some team sites, and I've got a central admin. So I'm just going to go and fire up old school PowerShell, because in true Blue Peter fashion, I've got my scripts pre-created, right? Only Todd Bleeker would be suicide enough to write his scripts live on stage. So you can see here we've got our, let me just get that formatted in. Let's just get that running. So you can see here that we're creating a standard claims-based web app. So we're creating the auth provider first, and then followed by the host web app, which is port 80, using the authentication provider that I've just built. And of course, if you haven't noticed yet in SharePoint 13, claims is the default, right? There is no classic anymore unless you do it in PowerShell, and even then it complains at you, telling you that you really shouldn't be doing it anymore, because claims is, I'll use the term fixed in 2013. What they mean by we fixed everything is it's either in it or they've just got rid of it. Because there was almost one component, I don't know if anybody remembers from SharePoint 2010, where search-based alerts didn't work in claims, right? And there's a few other bits and bobs. Actually, in the beta testing, search alerts still didn't work in claims. It was only right at the end to RTM that they got it to work, which is why it's all back in again now. So we're basically creating that web app. And so I'm just going to create the auth provider. So I'm going to create a claims auth provider first. And then we'll run this little PowerShell script here that's going to create that web application with no host header. Now you'll notice that within this bit here, notice in the center there it's saying HTTP SharePoint 1. So I've only got one SharePoint server here, so I can use the local host name as my provider name. Now some of you may use load balance front-end servers. So you could either use HTTP localhost, or you could actually put an NLB address of your network load balance to make sure that this is answerable to both servers. Because obviously if you're going to do network load balancing and you're going to have a clustered IP, in DNS you're going to have something like nlb.mycompany.com, not portal.mycompany.com. We're not load balancing SharePoint web apps here. We're just load balancing this particular root web app. So I might just, when I create my load balance cluster, create it with an nlb.mycluster.com or whatever it is, and I could use that instead if I'm doing multiple web front-end servers. So let's run that. And whilst that's running that, because I have all the faith in the world that my PowerShell script will work. So one of the things that I've done here that's different is that I've actually allocated it an IP address. So this is kind of preempting SSL. Because if I was going to do SSL, I'd really give it a fixed IP, right? That's what we should be doing with SSL. But more to the point, even if you're just using port 80, I still, with this web app, like to give it a fixed IP. And the reason I do this is, remember I went earlier, I was talking about this DNS name that we're going to create. The DNS name, if I create a new lookup zone in DNS, I can say to it, everything that goes to tbdapps.com or mycompanyapps.com, this is the SharePoint cluster IP that will answer to that request. So whatever I use as my NLB clustered IP, or in my case, my single IP, I can tell DNS that they are the servers that will answer the request for those apps. So I could actually target app requests just to the web front-end servers, which would be what we'd want to do in the real world. We don't want people going to the middle-tier servers when their request is coming from the front-end client. So using a fixed IP, now originally a lot of the documentation that came out pre-RTM, there were a lot of people putting stuff like subdomains in DNS, and they weren't using fixed IP, they were just using wildcard to a zone. Personally, I found that that leaves a lot of open potential issues of security, whereas this way gives me complete control of where that traffic is routed to for the apps, which is why I like to use a fixed IP, either a clustered IP or a single IP for a machine. I'm going to set that up in a minute. So what are we trying to achieve here with this web app? So here's a standard setup that we currently have. Standard SharePoint site we've set up. We've got a My Site web app on port 80 using all unassigned IP, http my.spevo.com. We've also got a portal web application, all unassigned IP, portal.spevo.com. So we're using the premise of host headers on each website to determine where the traffic gets routed to, right? And then we've got the default website, which is port 80, no host header, all unassigned. So this is your bucket. This is your current bucket catch-all. So what happens? A user sits there, types http my.spevo.com, goes into IIS. IIS looks at the header, looks for the website that matches the header, sends them to the correct website. The user then goes to a SharePoint app, and the request comes back that says you need to go to http spapp.spevo.com. So IIS goes, I have no such host header for that in IIS. So what does it do? It sends it to the current default website. That's what we can't have, because obviously the apps won't get deployed properly. So what do we want to do? We want to have the default website not enabled. We want to have the same current host headers for the My Sites and the portal, but when a user types the spapp.spevo.com, it's going to that new empty bucket web that has no host header, but we've obviously fixed that IP address. So it gets routed correctly to that catch-all bucket. And think about this. The reason that we're doing this is, what if I've got lots of web applications in my SharePoint farm with lots of URLs? My apps can't be one of those URLs. The apps have to be URL independent so that they could be hosted in any of those different web application URL structures and still work with their own unique names. There's another reason, though, why the apps have a unique name from a security perspective. And there's two things that we've got to show you here. Number one, you'll notice that I have two team sites in this example. I have a sales and a HR underneath a site collection. And then you'll notice underneath the sales one, I've got an app site, commonly referred to as a subweb. Yeah? So in the developer world, or in the coding world, it's an SP web, right? Not a site, it's an SP web. So when we deploy an app, so if I go and say, I'm going to go to the sales site, and I'm going to add this new sales workflow app, and I click it to install it in that sales site, what happens at that point is the app creates a new child site underneath it. And it's the child site that hosts all the details of the app, any workflow logic, any extra lists and libraries that it needs, any other data that it runs around, that's all in that child site. It does not go in the actual sales site. One of the things that they do to secure this app is within the browser, there's something called same origin policy. And if they didn't secure the site logic, what could potentially happen is there could be a dubious bit of JavaScript running in that child site that would try and bounce across all the other site logic, up and down, across and round, and try and run in all lots of different places. The same origin policy stops that happening. So the reason it creates its own unique app name and hosts itself in its own app site is so that it cannot, by default, hop sites and through malicious JavaScript code. From an IT pro's perspective, what else does this mean? Well, can we change that for a start? No, this is the way it works. So, like it or not, you've got it. What does this mean? This means, what if we deploy 5,000 apps? Are we therefore going to have 5,000 child sites? Yep. Can the users see them? Nope. Can we see them? Yep. We can PowerShell it and find out, and I'll show you how to do that. Can we back them up? Of course we can. If we delete the app, does it delete the subweb? Yep. So it's very clean. So we don't have to worry about the management of this stuff. It's very clean and it handles itself well. But just know that it's there, and that's why it's there. So this DNS thing that I keep talking about. Now, of course, you guys are going to have fun with this in the office, right? When you go back and say, hey, I need a new forward lookup DNS domain name. At which point you're told, go away, person trying to infiltrate our Active Directory and DNS model. But the reality is that you're going to have one, because this is how we manage the app domain model. So what does this actually mean when we create one? Well, let me show you how we create one. Because this is another one of those mysteries, isn't it? When you go to a company and you say, I'd like a new DNS forward lookup zone, and they say, oh, that's going to take 8 weeks. And this is the bit where we see, actually, Steve showed me that. It takes about 20 seconds, actually. Very simple. So here's our DNS tree. Oh, no, that's not actually a directory, see. Let's go to the right one. DNS, forward lookup zones. And we can see under here we've got our single domain name, which is trainspotdave.com. And all I'm going to do is create a new zone. So this is basically going to be a standalone domain name purely that's going to be used in our app name logic. So I'm going to call this one evoapps.com. Obviously, we don't want it conflicting with anything else that's used internally at all. It's a generic name that's just going to be used for apps. So we do that, we do that. Now, obviously, the DNS guys would decide whether it's stored on all their domain controllers or just DNS servers. But that's it. That's a forward lookup zone. The only thing that we don't have in this forward lookup zone is a record that says what to do with anything that comes here. It's not like I'm going to have a host A goes to 10.003 and a host B goes to 10.004. What I want to happen here is I want anything that tries to go to evoapps.com to go to my SharePoint servers that are going to answer the request for the apps. So if I go down to my SharePoint box here, the script ran. No troubleshooting for that one, sorry. Yeah. So here's our network card for this particular box. And in my IP settings, I've got here one IP address. So that's our default IP address. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to add a new IP address into the SharePoint server. Or if I was doing network load balancing, that would add a load balanced IP address here for me, right? So let's add 10.0.088 into that. Now 10.0.088, so I now know what this is going to be. So I'm going to create a new A record of a wildcard, and I'm going to tell it that the SharePoint server or servers, the answer to that request is my load balanced IP or my SharePoint server. Okay? And that's all I need to do from a DNS point of view. I'm not hosting A records here. It's just literally acting as the redirector for that unique domain name. If I go back to SharePoint 1, go back to IIS, let's see what we would also need to do here. And of course, the fact that I'm going here, the fact that I'm going into this place right now, this place of evilness, if IIS, what does it mean I've got to think about if I'm going to make changes here? Anybody? What's it not going to do? Not going to propagate it at all. So anything I change here, I need to think about A, documenting, and B, replicating it on multiple web front-end servers if I'm going to do the same thing. So the default website that we've got here, remember that default website? Notice it has stopped. Manage website says start this service. So this website has actually automatically stopped. Why? Because I created another one that was on port 80 that did the same job. My new one went, hey, you go away. And so it is done. It has gone. But you should always check after you run that just to make sure that the right web apps are stopped and the right ones are started. Because my hosting web app, which is there, my SP host, is the one that started correctly. If I go to my bindings, so here's my bindings here, currently doing HTTP because I didn't create it with HTTPS, also on port 80, but no mention of the IP address. So I'm going to fix that as well. So I'm going to go into the bindings, and I'm going to assign my new 10.00.88. We still have that bug in network load balancing, where if you add a load balance clustered IP, it's not shown here. You just type it in manually, and it's still there, obviously. So we'll assign it that. We don't need to do a host name. We're not hosting host names for this web app. Even if you're going to use it for host name site collections, we don't add host names into this website. So that's done that alignment now of the IP address to the DNS entry. How can we test it? Dead easy. We ping anything at tbdapps.com, and it will get a reply. Of course it's going to get a reply, because it's going to get a reply from the SharePoint server, not from any specific web app. We're not pinging a web app. We're just pinging the SharePoint's IP address. Start the server services. So we've got two services that we need to have started in Central Admin, the SharePoint Foundation Subscription Settings Service and the App Management Service. Either do PowerShell or through the UI. Both are still there. So let's show you the UI one. So let's go to our Central Admin, into our System Settings, Services on Server. See, this is a problem when you talk for more than 30 minutes and not go into Central Admin. I know I should have clicked it earlier. Let's just wake that baby up. Once we've started these two services, we're good to go in terms of creating the actual service apps themselves. The subscription settings service app actually is the same as it was in 2010. PowerShell is the only way we can create that subscription service. App management service we can do either in PowerShell or in the UI. Have you all found SharePoint 2010? Do you remember when you were starting services on server, it was always better to start them before you created the actual service apps? Remember that? Like manage metadata. It always worked quicker, didn't it, if you created these things first? Nothing's changed. It's all exactly the same, the way it works with that. So app management service, there it is, so we can start that. And it's much more polite 2013, isn't it? We've noticed that. It's working on it. It shouldn't take long. Of course, it bloody lies. It can sometimes sit there forever. In fact, how many of you have tried to create something in SharePoint 2013 and you found that it just sits there spinning? And it sits there forever, right? And you kind of go, oh, it's hung. It's not done it. And if you actually go under the hood, it has actually created all the objects. It just didn't complete the refresh page loop and then take you to the finished page. Very buggy in 2013, we've noticed the UI. You don't get it in PowerShell, but in the UI, we've noticed that. So if you sit there and you think it's hung, just go under the hood, look in IIS, launch another central admin page, and you find it's all there, and you're like, oh, man. And let's start the subscription service there. So we're starting that. See, it should say this won't take long again, shouldn't it? I mean, really. There we go. So those two have started. So good. Tick box for that slide. Next one. Create the subscription settings service. So this is exactly the same as we had in 2010. So you got a PowerShell script for this in 2010. You can just rinse and repeat. First thing is, obviously, you need to have a managed account for it. Then we need to create the application pool. Then we need to create the service, and then we create the proxy. Same process as previously done for 2010. Now, even if you're not using multi-tenancy, though, you must do this. So let's go back to our PowerShell scripts. And here's one for our app management service. So I'm using an account called SP Collab for this. From an architectural point of view, you're definitely going to have to be a lot more careful with 2013 than you maybe were a bit looser before in 2010 with your service accounts, how many service accounts and app pools you're going to use, because obviously we've got a lot more services, and a lot more hardware resource hungriness. Did Brian give you a good overview of that when he was doing his session, right, on the hardware requirements now? So you're certainly going to have to do a lot more thought process around scalable server models rather than one big server with lots of app pools on it, because that's just not going to work in 2013. I mean, our laptops, all of the laptops, if you speak to me and Spence and any of us that are building like larger farm designs in terms of testing, I mean, we're already at 32 gig for all our laptops. I mean, it just won't run anything less the minute you start to scale it out and test. It's just no way of doing it. So we've actually now got multiple laptops, 32 gigs with like crossovers to run them, just to do proper testing. It's the only way we can test it properly. Or you've got an ESX server or something, right, to test it on. The days of having an 8 gig laptop for an IT, in fact, the devs, I feel sorry for the devs, right? Because they're all going into their management going, we need 24 gig laptops minimum. The guys are just going, what? So a lot of companies that I've been speaking to that have got big dev teams, they're going the sensible route now, which is to start giving them complete virtualized models to dev against. They don't actually dev on their laptops anymore, they just virtualize in and run it all on hosted platforms. Well prepared, these scripts, have you noticed? So far, so good. I shouldn't have said that, should I? That's like the most stupidest thing a presenter should ever say. Look at these things working. Hey? Yeah, a PowerShell response, saying I'm working on it. I could put that in. We could have one of those. And so finally, we're going to create the proxy. There we go. So going to central administration now. Let's see if we've got our service app. This should enable us to see the fact that we've got our Evo there's that. So there you go. So we've got our Evo service app there. So that's the one we just created, happily started and aligned. Now we also need to do our app management service at the same time. So whilst we're here, rather than do this in PowerShell, I'll do this here for you to see. So here's our app management service. And so let's give this a very inventive name. Obviously, we need a database name. Remember, I said earlier, this is the database that's going to host all of that permissions logic that we use for our apps. That's going to store all of the app information and any security that we're going to put against it. Because when developers create apps, they're not just going to create them for use by everybody. They could turn around and say only certain groups of users are going to be able to do this type of work within the custom code. So that's going to all be stored in this database. And so let's create one for that. Application pools. So I am specifically going to use an existing app pool. I've actually created my 2 service app pools here. I would only actually create a dedicated app pool for service apps if I've got one that really needs it, and a very busy, maybe a BI one, for example, performance point. In a scalable model that we will have to have for 2013, my idea is to have more servers and use the same 2 app pools across servers, but have different services on the different servers, right? So I could have search on those 2 and Excel there maybe, and an app management service and other app servers consuming those same application pools. But because we're on different servers, they've all got their own memory and resources to consume, right? You will, I mean, this is a dedicated SharePoint box. I mean, where are we at the minute? What's it doing? 5 gig. I haven't got one user connecting to this at this point. And it's consuming 5 gig just sitting there. So that's pretty much it. Create it to the default proxy group. Yep. So let's create that. But for a lot of you that are coming, how many of you are coming from a 2010 background at this point in time? How many of you got 2010 up and running in your environment? Most of you. 2007, anybody? Yep. 2003? Ah, cool. Or maybe not. It depends which way you're trying to approach it. Oh yeah, fresh start, right? Completely fresh start. So 2007, obviously you're going to be redesigning your whole app services anyway, and your service applications and hardware, logic, etc. Hopefully virtualized is the way to go, right? We should all be thinking virtualization going forward. For those of you from 2010, of course, you've just probably invested a whole ton of money in the last 2 years on your hardware for 2010 just to go, I knew we should have bought that extra server, or I knew we were going to need it, and I can't believe I didn't get the money for it. And it is one of those things now where you are going to have to really redesign a lot of your hardware architecture to support it. Virtualization, of course, if you've done that, is going to save you a heap of work. Okay, so that's done. So we've got our application management service, that's done. Configure the app URLs. So this is the bit that we've been talking about all this time in terms of creating our infrastructure to support that unique app URL. And you'll notice that in central administration, we're going to define two field values. We're going to define the app domain, and the app domain must mirror what we did in DNS. It's that same app domain that we created. Then there's the app prefix. So this is the central admin prefix that's going to be aligned to all apps. And we can see that right here. App prefix is Corp Farm app, for example. That's my app prefix, whatever I decide to call it. It then gives you this lovely GUID, in this case 40E04B, blah, blah, blah. Every app will have a unique identity. It is the subscriptions service whose job it is to manage those IDs. So you create 20 apps. Each app will have a unique ID. I don't just mean create 20 apps. Let me rephrase that. Use the app 20 times. So if I deploy one app into a site collection logic and my users use it in 20 different sites, each of those app subsites will have its own ID. So it's not the app itself that gets the ID, it's when the app is deployed that the app gets its own ID. And we could see that because you can see in this example here, it has its unique ID, then it goes tbdapps.com. So there's our domain name. There's our unique DNS domain right there. Then it comes into /departments/sales/subsite name. And that subsite name right at the end is where the app has been deployed into its own child site, its own child web. And that's how each app, as it gets deployed, is identified in SharePoint as to where it lives, so that it can't conflict. And that's also the reason, remember I mentioned that JavaScript for the security model to stop the origin policy from allowing it to hop. That's how that works. It's because it uses it against your unique identity. Because obviously if the unique identity was http://myportal.com, it could go anywhere because the same origin looks like it's the same URL. This is not the same URL. They're all unique. So we need to configure that. So let's go into, it is quite funny though, isn't it, that they actually give it its own little nav on the left. Now, call me cynical, but I thought search was pretty important as well. But we can get to our little app management page straight from the UI. And here we can configure our configure app URLs. We can also configure our store settings. So if as a central admin, we want to control who's allowed to, rather than say let users go and request apps, that we want all apps to be requested first. So there's like an approval process. We can force that to happen. We can manage our licenses. So if we've purchased a bunch of apps, we can see the licenses that have been applied to those apps, what the subscription model is for it. Of course, a lot of the subscription models aren't all quite honed yet. We're trying to get a subscription model for our app that we're trying to develop, and we're not having fun with it yet. So what should we call this? This is our app domain. So we've already created our app domain, didn't we? Was it Evo Apps? Remind myself, evoapps.com. Because I do want, we do want this thing to work first time, right? So there's our evoapps.com, and there's our app prefix. So this is whatever we want to call it, but obviously it's, it'd be stupid to call it mushrooms or something. And I still haven't got, I've struggled to get past the word apps. I don't know. I'm open to suggestions for this one. Huh? Just a number? It's some another string. Oh, app O. Oh. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure about putting numerics there. So there's our app URLs are done. So that's checkbox for that one.
Can I ask a question quickly? Can you rewrite in UAG public URL of the apps for that?
Can you use UAG to rewrite the URLs?
So you example, external domain to internal domain, both on SSL, with a different SSL certificate, external and internal.
I'll have to think about that one.
Or do you have to choose public domain?
It does support, you could do reverse proxy SSL. I'll have to think about whether I'd actually do it for the apps though. To have a completely different external SSL certificate is what you're saying, right? Correct, and if I was doing that, I would use a public domain name that I was going to host it with, yeah. Yeah, personally if I was doing that. Whether I could get it to work through UAG, I don't know. I'd have to think about whether I'd do that or not. I've not tried that with a different URL externally than internal. I haven't tried that. So there's the app URL. Now there is a slight thing to note here from the release RTM that comes out with the PU update or the CU update, depends on which one you're using. But in the March update for SharePoint, there was an addition, which is where I'm thinking of the reverse proxy piece that we're looking at here, where they did add the ability for it to support reverse proxies now. So we should be able to do reverse proxying through ISA and TMG that supports this happily now. Although, like I say, I haven't tested it. This literally just came out in March. But it does also allow us to support alternate access mappings URL, which we could not support in RTM. So we could now extend and map and have a second URL for external access, for example, and it will now support that for the app domains. So we can now use PowerShell for the new SP Web Application app domain to support that extranet URL that we're pushing out to the users. So that's probably answering that question that you're looking for about using a different domain for the outside extranet. But you must make sure you put the update on for that from March as a minimum, is when they introduced that. When you deploy that, there's a new feature that's deployed. You must activate that feature first, and then you get the facility to do the new SP Web App domain. So the site collection that we're going to use to host it, well, let's go and have a look at that. So if we go to our App Catalogue, this is basically saying, okay, have you got an App Catalogue, or do you need to create one? And notice that it's very specifically pointing us to a web application realm, that it's saying that, you need to align this to a web app URL, which makes things potentially more complex, especially if you've got, obviously, multiple web apps hosting different types of content internally on-prem. You're going to end up with a catalog on each web app, which means you're going to have to deploy the apps multiple times. So the argument whether, does apps replace farm solutions? The answer is not always an app. The answer could quite happily still be a farm solution, right? So I'm not ruling that one out. So I'm going to go to my portal web app. This is where I'm going to put my catalog, and I'm going to create a new one. Now, obviously, if you want to create this catalog in its own managed path, for example, or you're going to use hostname site collections, you need to obviously create this through PowerShell or have your managed paths ready. So let's just Evo catalog. Have I got a man? No, I didn't. It doesn't matter. We'll just create one there. But you'll notice that it needs a primary site admin, so that's me, obviously. Not that I don't trust anybody else, but... And then we've got the end user group. So this is, I would love to see this in every site collection template, the ability to say, which users would you like to, by generic rights, be able to read this site or this page as a group? So it's really nice. It's not a site administrator. It's who's allowed to actually go here and see the apps in the catalog and browse it. Now, you could use individuals, or you can create an Active Directory domain, or you could do authenticated users or domain users. It depends who you want to do as a catch-all or a not catch-all and restrict it as to who can use it. I kind of like that. I think that's a pretty nice option to have. Quota templates, if we're going to limit it to the site collection, obviously, because quota templates are always on a site collection. Why would we do that with apps? So that's creating this site collection. So this site collection is now aligning to the web app And I can now go to that site collection and add my apps to it. So at this point, we're actually ready to go. The infrastructure bit's been done. We've done DNS, we've done service subscription, we've created our app catalog. We just need some apps. So where's that? And there we go. So we've got the site collection ready. If we actually go to the site URL, what you're going to notice is that this is not just for on-prem SharePoint apps. This catalog is also for hosting the Office apps, the Agave. I'm still trying to figure out the right way to say this, because you could have quite, Agave. I don't know, there's multiple ways that we can think of this. But these are developers also having the ability to build apps that deploy within the Office application. So for example, we're building an Outlook client, we're sending an email out to people, there's a meeting we're going to in a particular pub, and we want everybody to have the map to the pub. So we could launch a Bing Maps bit of code inside the email that launches off and fetches information and drops it into the Office app. So these Agave apps can be developed as well as SharePoint apps and managed in this same catalog site collection. So we're not just talking about managing our custom apps for SharePoint specific, we're Office apps as well. Oh, it's being polite again. Do we think that people are actually going to get fed up of being polite? It's going to happen, isn't it? It's just so... Now, you can actually click the little spinny dots and stops them. What did you say? Actually, so somebody actually said that. I don't know if it was a demo for this conference, but somebody actually posted in a distribution group recently, can somebody please do me that in German or something? So somebody did a screenshot and sent it them. So yeah, they get it in their language. So there we go. So there's the app catalog, and on the left-hand side, slightly different team site, obviously, template. There's our apps for Office, apps for SharePoint, and app requests. So the app requests is where users have, we've restricted that all apps must be requested first before we go and approve them and download them or pay for them. And apps for Office is our Agave apps, and then apps for SharePoint is what we're talking about. So I'm going to go to my apps for SharePoint. In fact, Miriam, I'm so glad you're in here. So Miriam did a little app for me recently when I was saying, I need an app. So she developed me an app. But I wanted a classic app. See, Spence knows where I'm coming from here. I wanted a Hello World app. But she gave me a Hello You. Oh. Thank you, Miriam, for that, by the way. So here's our app. Obviously, we've got version comments in there. So full version support, update, managing the app itself is supported, right? Because obviously, we're not going to necessarily keep the app in its original form. There's going to be updates. For information on how all that stuff works, you need to go in the developer track because they're covering the app lifecycle and creation and management of those in the dev track. But I just thought it'd be cool to see one actually get used in our scenario. So we get a description, and then a longer description, and then icon URLs. I've never seen anything in my life with so many icon URLs and video URLs. I mean, we could do so much cool stuff making people believe it's something it's not. Look at all these icons. We can do all sorts of stuff. Brilliant. And we could say, is it a featured app, which is basically elevating it to the top of the app structure, so it's like a top app for the business. Now, we've got to be a bit careful what we do with this, because obviously by default, everyone's going to tick that box. It's not really going to serve much purpose if we keep ticking it all the time. And then it gets put in the noteworthy section. So there's our app. I'll put another one in there. I've got a couple. I went and pinched the Lightning Tools one, because I actually wanted to see, because the Lightning Tool guys created their social one for the 365. It's not you can't buy it for on-prem. So I pinched it to see if it worked on-prem. It doesn't. But you notice that I can fill in obviously my bits here, but you'll notice that because I filled in the Evo category on the previous app, I've got the same category available now, so it's easy to start categorizing your apps for when you're browsing them and creating a view structure. I'll just save that one in as well. So we've got a couple of apps. Now we can obviously see this screen's going to fill up nice and big over time. So let's go and get one of these apps working. So let's go to a team site. So here's my portal homepage here. Let's go back to it. Let's go to an app list or library. What I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy one of those apps in 3 places, and then I'm going to run a PowerShell script to show you those sub-sites with the unique IDs that were created, because it's kind of important that we see what has happened under the hood. When we're doing like backups and restores, these sub-sites are being backed up through your backup tools. If you've got a third-party product that you're using, you need to make sure they support this, right? So here's our apps we can add. Here's our Hello app and our Lightning Chat app. Obviously, we don't have the icons because we didn't fill in those 18 fields. That's just one of many icons you can get. There's another icon. See, there's multiple icon locations. So there's that one. So do you trust it? Yeah, sure. Why not? Very trusting person. And then it adds the app. So this depends on how big the app is. You know, what is this app doing in the background? How much stuff is it building into that new team site that it's building as a child site? Because that's what's happening right now. It's building that child team site and setting up the app to be used. And it depends what the app does that determines, you know, what gets created after this. You know, whether we suddenly go into a document library and there's a new ribbon icon that appears or a new quick launch icon on the left. You know, the apps can do whatever they're told to do. Whatever the developers have built it in terms of its navigation. So that will eventually update. So whilst that's doing that, I'm going to add to the IT Pro, and we'll add an app here as well. So we'll add the same one. Come on, wake up. Did that finally get, oh, there you go. Oh. And there's Miriam's lovely icon. Very nice icon, by the way. Very nice. Okay, it's working on now. Let's go and add it again. So notice that as a user, I'm on every site adding these apps. I'm not deploying it en masse. The catalog has made it available to all of my users. It's up to them to add it in the way that we're using it here. Let's wait for that to finish. And let me go back to, which one was that, IT Pro? Let's go into Developer. And whilst I'm here, let me add the Lightning Chat one. And that's going to add that as well. So whilst they're getting themselves set up, let's go back into PowerShell. So what I did was I just wrote a very simple little script for showing all the subwebs. And it's just a really simple, get your web application, get all your sites that are in there, pipe it into the get SP webs, no limit, just select all and show them. Just so that I can see all those child webs, not just the sites for the team sites. So let's run that. And then what we should be finding on the back of this is that we should be getting those 3 apps that we've added. We should see 3 unique child sites with those app IDs that have been assigned through the subscription service, through the app domain that we created, and the app prefix. It had better work because it's past. Oh, gosh. So there we go. So what we can see here, see our 3 apps? See those 3 unique IDs? Even though they actually look the same, it's only the last 2 characters that have changed on each one. We've then got the .evoapps.com. So there's our domain name for the DNS that we configured. We've then got the /itpro/hello and the name of the app that's been deployed. So we can see that we've got the Lightning Tools one for the Lightning Chat and the IT Pro for the Hello You app. So that's how we as IT pros are going to be able to script and be able to find out what's being deployed, how many apps have been deployed, etc. We can obviously pipe that into showing us more information in terms of numbers and sites that have been created. And that will form part of your backup strategy as well. And that's pretty much it. That's setting up the on-prem app service for SharePoint. Once we've done our bit, right, it's ready to go, job done. We are happily just sitting back and feet on desk drinking coffee again. All be done in an hour. But don't tell your boss that, right? So I think we're done. It's past. I'll be around for some questions whilst Spence... So you're after me, Spence, right? Are you after me? Yeah, so I'm here for questions afterwards. If not, feel free to go and grab coffee. And thanks for coming.